Hello, Courtney. Got any exciting weekend plans? No? Me neither. So Corey, my son's in the Boulder Arrowhead League.
Oh, okay.
And that's crazy. Games all weekend.
Yeah. Who's he playing?
Laurel on Saturday. Sunday, Burlington, maybe? You really do a good job, I'll give them that, but it's a lot of time.
Yeah, for sure.
Hey, Brendan, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. We'll give 3 minutes and then officially start. Ready for that elevation mask, Courtney?
No.
Michael?
Okay.
Well, there's hesitation initially, I think, Tuesday, but then you get it on and you start pedaling. And
Once you get used to
Doable.
it, it's not.
I did. It's definitely doable. Close enough. So we'll go ahead and begin. Door. Okay, so I have a little bit of congestion, so I may have to have a sip of water every once in a while. But, so today we're starting chapter 3, And this is on anaerobic exercise. So looking at that side of the continuum versus aerobic and how it's different. So prescription of aerobic exercise is different than anaerobic. So sprints and resistance training and so on is prescribed differently, still using the FIT principle. So remember our FIT principle, frequency, and then you have intensity, and then you have time, and then I know some textbooks add on type at the end, so another T on the end. So I'd like to go through a little activity. This will be for your participation points for today, so you'll turn this in. So we have two parts for participation today. The first part is looking at an actual study and trying to pick out how aerobic versus anaerobic prescription is different. So if you'd be willing, just pull out a sheet of paper. And we're going to look at kind of an old study. This is 28 years ago, but still timely today. If you read the title, Impact of Exercise Intensity on Body Fatness and Skeletal Muscle Metabolism. So what I liked, hey Jackie, what I liked about this study is a direct comparison over time of how endurance training changes our body, as well as how anaerobic sprint training can change our bodies. So this is the abstract, and if you go through the abstract, you might recognize some of the enzymes that were discussed. So this is within the methods under the training programs, a description of the training programs. So what I'd like you to do on your paper is make two columns. You'll at the top of the first column you'll put ET for endurance training, and then at the top of the other column you'll put HIIT. You remember from chapter 1 what that stands for? Yeah, high intensity interval training. We'll get to the results after we look at the difference in prescription, but what's interesting is they took skin fold assessment before and after the training. It wasn't really discussed whether calorie intake was controlled or they were just encouraged to continue eating how they normally do. But as a measure of change in body composition, there was a 6-site skin fold assessment that was taken. And then they took the sum before and after training. And then looking down here, this is a table looking at 4 different enzymes as a result of training. So I want to take just a few minutes and show you exactly where these enzymes are at, so you can see how these metabolic systems change as a result of these programs. So you can see the HK, okay, so that's hexokinase, all right? You can see, you remember PFK? PFK, so they looked at that one. So remember what it stands for?
Phosphofructokinase.
Phosphofructokinase, good. And then MDH is malate dehydrogenase. So that's part of the Krebs cycle. I'll show you where that's at. And then hydroxyacyl dehydrogenase is part of beta oxidation. So remember, what does beta oxidation have to do with? What are you breaking down? Fatty acids. Isn't that interesting? They looked at an enzyme that is directly involved in breakdown of fatty acids, and they looked at it before and after, and then the change. So let me take just a moment get to the prescriptive part in just a second, but I wanted to drift back to chapter 2 to show you where these enzymes are at. So remember, the first 2 enzymes are part of glycolysis. So breaking down glucose. So remember, we get what we train for. So if we're doing aerobic or sprint training, you might expect to see a change in our ability to break down glucose. So step 1, that's a reaction that involves hexokinase. This step 1, this glucose conversion to glucose 6-phosphate. That's hexokinase that catalyzes that reaction. And then step 3, fructose 6-phosphate to fructose 1,6-biphosphate. Okay, so that's your PFK. What do we know about PFK? Well, what's significant about that one? Yeah, that's the bottleneck right there. So that's interesting because if we can increase the activity of PFK, that means that's the limiting step. So the whole thing's going to go through faster. We're making ATP a lot faster if we're increasing the amount of PFK. So our bodies are changing in response to training activities. Okay, so that was the first 2. So let's go down here. So Krebs cycle. Okay. So looking at the Krebs cycle, it's a cycle of 8 different reactions. And so malate dehydrogenase comes in right here. So in converting malate to oxaloacetate, malate dehydrogenase catalyzes that reaction. So where is the Krebs cycle? Where is that whole process taking place? Yeah, mitochondria, whereas glycolysis, those 10 steps, sometimes 11, is taking place where? Yeah, cytoplasm. Okay, so now we're in the mitochondria. So we increase the activity of that enzyme and we're automatically providing more oxaloacetate, which is important because oxaloacetate binds with acetyl-CoA and it just makes breakdown of carbohydrate faster. So we're able to go through this cycle at a faster rate. They only looked at one enzyme, but probably all these enzymes, isocitrate dehydrogenase, the limiting step was increased. So they just looked at one. Okay, so the 4th enzyme, where does that come into play now? So we talked about beta oxidation. Okay, all right, so a couple things about beta oxidation. So we're taking fatty acids and we are ultimately converting them into acetyl-CoA. So you already know that. So I'm not asking you to memorize all these intermediates, I'm just giving you the overall picture. So remember with beta oxidation, we have to invest the equivalent of what, 2 ATP, right? Because we go from ATP to AMP. Okay, and then with beta oxidation, we're making, remember, 1 FAD and 1 NAD. So the enzyme that they looked at through this process, converting a fatty acid, a long-chain fatty acid down here, ultimately getting to acetyl-CoA, and then acetyl-CoA goes into the Krebs cycle. This is the enzyme that they looked at, beta-hydroxyacyl-CoA. So that they were just looking at that as representative, okay, what's our fat burning ability like? And that's fascinating to actually go inside a muscle fiber and look at how these enzymes are changing. So, okay, so getting back, so now you kind of have a background. Okay, so I want you to read the first 2 paragraphs right here, and I want you to see if you can fill out your table in terms of frequency, intensity, and time for endurance training and high intensity interval training. Now, don't be fooled by this first sentence in the second paragraph. So you have to read the whole thing. So let me preface this by asking you a question. if you're taking an untrained population, why would it be a good thing to maybe, if it's high intensity interval training, why would it be a good thing to maybe have them do lower intensity exercise for the first few weeks versus just throwing them into sprints?
Allow their body to adjust.
Yeah, it's a principle of progression, right? Progression. So with that in mind, go ahead and read through those first two paragraphs. See if you can fill out that table for each type of exercise. So frequency, intensity, and time for endurance versus high intensity interval training. If you have access to D2L, this is just in the chapter 3 PowerPoint. You can go in and look at it. Take about 2 more minutes, finish it up. Pull it back together. So let's talk about endurance training to start with, frequency. So what did you get on that one? So the frequency did change over the 20 weeks. So they started out with how many sessions per week? 4, increasing to 5. Okay, so how was the intensity prescribed for the endurance training? Pretty classic American College of Sports Medicine recommended intensity of what percentage of maximal heart rate reserve? Yeah, 60, and then what did it say, going up to increase to 85% of maximal heart rate reserve. So we typically prescribe aerobic exercise based on a percentage of maximal heart rate. So there's different equations. Maximal heart rate reserve is sometimes called the Carbonin formula. And so because the exercise is steady state, and what does it mean for exercise to be steady state?
Consistent at like the same kind of.
Yeah, so you're just kind of cruising along. It's below the anaerobic threshold. So continuous at a mostly the same pace, 60 to 85% maximal heart rate reserve. So the reason we use heart rate is because it correlates really well with oxygen uptake. So aerobic metabolism is all about having sufficient oxygen. So the more oxygen we consume, the higher the heart rate will be. So it's a proportional relationship. So your heart rate goes up a certain amount and your oxygen uptake goes up in proportion. So they're proportionate, so it's practical. So you can't, in a practical setting, you really can't ask somebody what's your oxygen consumption, but what can you do? You can ask them to check their pulse, right? You can get a heart rate, or if you have a watch or something to monitor that, that's practical. Okay, so what was the time? Again, pretty consistent ACSM guidelines. Started with 30 and then ended up 40. So it's a classic cardio fitness type of prescription. Okay, so that's great. And you get some results from that. Okay, so high intensity interval training. So they said right here at the beginning that they began with 25 30-minute sessions of continuous exercise at 70% of maximal heart rate reserve at an intensity comparable to the imposed endurance training program. Okay, so this was essentially the build-up phase, because the way this is described right here is that interval training. No, it's not interval training, it's continuous training. So it was a progression. So they're building them up to it. You take an untrained person and you've got to do something initially to get them moving before you go into high intensity stuff. Okay, so then we get into the interval training. So they perform 19 short and 16 long interval sessions over a period of 15 weeks. So the first 5 weeks they're building into it. The last 15 weeks is when they are hitting this interval training really hard. So short intervals, what did they define as a short interval time-wise? Their short intervals were how long? How long were they sprinting?
15.
Okay, so yeah, so you go on further described, and so the short interval work consisted initially of 10, later 15 bouts of 15 seconds, increasing to 30 seconds. So that's 10 to 15 repetitions of 15 to 30 seconds. How many have done anything similar to that? That's hard, right? Yeah, that's pretty hard. How did they know when to do the next repetition? Did they measure that?
When their heart rate returned to 120, 130 beats.
Yeah. Okay, so that's, in a research setting, we try to control as much as we can. So they said, okay, well, when your heart rate returns to that, then you can go ahead and do the next one. Okay, so with high intensity interval training, heart rate is not necessarily used is not used to gauge the intensity of the bouts, but it can be used to indicate recovery. So that's important. So recovery heart rate, and then you're ready to go for the next one. How long were the long intervals when they did a session that involved the long sprints? 60 to 90 seconds. That hurts. How many have done something as hard as you can go for 60 to 90 seconds? That's like 400 meter, well, yeah, it'd be like doing 400 meter repeats around a track. And I remember in high school when we did those, it was like 4, and that was it. So they were really working these people pretty hard. So the difference in the intensity. So intensity from an anaerobic standpoint is not based on maximal heart rate. Did you catch right at the end how they regulated intensity?
Maximal work output.
Yeah, maximal work output. So all of this was controlled on a fancy cycle ergometer where they could, the software, like what we have, you've seen our Cadillac bike in the lab that can do all the stuff that they do here. We can measure exactly how much of your maximal work output. So how many of you have done anaerobic exercise where it was prescribed based on a percentage of your max? Yes. How many of you have done strength training? What's it based on? A percentage of what? Percentage of your max, right? That's anaerobic exercise. So in this case, the intensity of the short exercise bouts was initially fixed at 60% of the maximal work output in 10 seconds. So they have them do a maximal work output test, probably similar to a Wingate test, and then the software gives them a number back that says this is how much work output you have, and then they're going to say 60% of that, and that's how much they'll maintain for the short exercise sprints, so the 15 to 30 second ones. And that of the long exercise bouts corresponded to 70% of the individual maximal work output in 90 seconds. So it's given to you. It's kind of hard to comprehend unless you're actually doing that research and you can see the software that a nice cycle ergometer will give you. But just know that it's a percentage of max is what we're looking at. So can everybody see the difference in anaerobic versus aerobic prescription? So let's take a look at the results. So what's going on inside their muscles? So it's all about increasing our body's capacity to provide energy, isn't it? That's really what it's all about, is being able to better meet the energy demand. If we do, then we fatigue less. So looking at before and after in the change, which program looked like induced greater change in those enzymes? Glycolytic enzymes, Krebs cycle enzymes, beta oxidation. Yeah, so at least in this particular study, there was change across the board with the high intensity interval training. Glycolytic enzymes, Krebs cycle, beta oxidation across the board. With the endurance training, not much going on with your glycolytic enzymes. More going on with Krebs cycle and beta oxidation. So why does that make sense? Why does that make sense that we're not getting much with the fast glycolytic enzymes with endurance training? Yeah, you're not going through fast glycolysis. You're using slow glycolysis, and then that slow glycolysis then continues into the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain and so on. So you are getting an upregulation of your fat-burning enzyme there. Look at this change though, a twofold change in fat-burning enzymes. So considerable there with the high intensity interval training. So then looking at the change in the sum of 6 skin folds. So we're looking at the percent change between the endurance training This is the percentage or the millimeters of change. Changes in the sum of 6 skin folds. So this would be the amount of change that's represented right here over the course of the 20 weeks. Endurance versus high intensity. Corrected, I need to go back and look at exactly what they were correcting. But again, you can see there. So skin folds, what are we talking about? What fat compartment are we talking about? Subcutaneous or visceral? Yeah, so it's the fat compartment right underneath the skin, right? So it looks like almost 9 times greater change to the subcutaneous fat induced by the high intensity interval training. So if we're not using fatty acids during high intensity interval training, what period of time is it that we're expending all of those fat calories? Afterwards, yes, afterwards, that's the key. Afterwards, the excess post-exercise oxygen consumption period. And that's the key, is if you have no orthopedic limitations, no cardiovascular limitations and so on, and you're motivated and able to work out at a high intensity, then do it. Because that's going to be the most beneficial and very time efficient as well, and you get all these great changes in your body composition and in your metabolic systems as well. Any questions on that? So 28 years ago, and we knew all this stuff. It's great. So now it's interesting just now, high intensity interval training has kind of become fashionable or popular, when 28 years ago we had all this information. Okay, so hang on to those papers because we've got a few more things to do. So introduction, anaerobic metabolism does not require oxygen to produce ATP. So we're talking about phosphagen system and fast glycolysis. So what's the end product of fast glycolysis? We get to step 10, we have pyruvate. We don't have sufficient oxygen, or the mitochondria are saying, nope, we're working at maximal capacity. What do you do with pyruvate? You convert it to lactate. We're going to talk about, in your text, there's an excellent quote. So I've read it so many times I wore out the page because I was just fascinated by that quote, but we'll get to that. Okay, so anaerobic and aerobic exercise are not mutually exclusive. What does that mean? Not mutually exclusive.
They're not independent of each other.
Yeah, it's not like light switches. You're not turning on the light switch, okay, now I'm aerobic, or another light switch, now I'm anaerobic. They're both operating all the time. So it's like a continuum. So there's an emphasis that's involved. So just stating, operating simultaneously. So the terms aerobic and anaerobic refer to the system predominating at the time. So we have 2 avenues for anaerobic, 1 avenue for aerobic. So here's our phosphagen system. Phosphagen system has multiple names. So important for you, so you're not confused, that the phosphagen system is sometimes called the ATP-PCR system, sometimes called the alactic. So think about that. What does alactic mean exactly? With lactate or no lactate? Means no lactate. So no lactate, the alactic anaerobic system. Because the other anaerobic system, which is fast glycolysis, does involve lactate. So this is saying this is anaerobic energy production without oxygen and without lactate. So how many steps is it? Remember? Fast. 1 step. So we call that the creatine kinase reaction. 1 step. So we have some ATP that is stored in muscle. And that's a good thing. But we use it up quickly, about 3 seconds. So it's nice. we have that storage there for immediate action to fuel muscle contraction. But we run out of those stores quickly, and so we have to resynthesize it. So the phosphagen, the ATP-PCR, or the alactic system is the quickest avenue to replenish stored ATP. And it's, again, so creatine kinase, remember that, creatine kinase reaction, and this is considered substrate level phosphorylation. So what does that word phosphorylation means? What does that mean again?
Phosphate.
Yeah. So we gotta get a phosphate from somewhere. What's our phosphate donor? Creatine phosphate, right? Creatine phosphate, phosphocreatine, that refers to the same substance. So that's our phosphate donor, easily available. We also can store phosphocreatine in our muscles as well. So regarding energy demand versus energy supply, the phosphagen system is the quickest method to replenish ATP supply. So it's a balance. Think of it like economics. We have an energy releasing reaction, and that's important because we have to have energy for muscle contraction, and everything that goes on in the body takes energy. It's like money, okay? There's a cost to everything inside the body. So we can break down ATP. It's like investing or spending money. So notice the enzyme, right? ATPase. So we go from ATP, which has how many phosphates? 3, and we require water. So we technically call it ATP hydrolysis because it requires water. We end up over here with ADP because we've broken off a phosphate, which is right here. And then we've used that free energy for muscle contraction or whatever else is going on in the cell. What's this over here? That'll come in later. Okay, so just hang on to that thought now because that becomes important later on. Okay, so we've spent money. So now we've got to build it back up again. So the phosphagen system is the quickest way to do that. Creatine kinase reaction, right? So we release a hydrogen ion up here. What are we doing over here? We're consuming it, right? So everything's in balance. Let me ask you a question. What's going to happen if we're breaking down ATP at a super fast rate, like we're doing lots of sprints and short rest intervals between sprints? How do your muscles start to feel? Yeah, you get that really intense burning sensation. You just want to lay down, okay? Fast sprints combined with short rest intervals. So we're breaking down ATP at a really fast rate, which it releases hydrogen ions, okay? And what if we're breaking it down faster than we can build it back up? What's the net effect on hydrogen ions in our muscles and tissues?
More than what you use.
Yeah. How do we define acidosis? How do we define acidosis within our body fluids, within muscle? What exactly is an acid or an acidifying reaction? What is the overall determining factor from your chemistry? What type of ion?
Hydrogen.
Hydrogen ion. Okay, now just think about this because we're going to come back to it. If we start breaking down ATP faster than we can rebuild it, we start to enter this increasingly acidic state. Because what is acidity dependent on? The concentration of hydrogen ions. Okay, so hang on to that because we'll come back to it later on. And the true cause of metabolic acidosis. So energy generating reaction, we're making ATP. So if these two processes are equal, then it's homeostasis, right? No change, constancy in the body's internal environment. So we have this nice creatine phosphate that provides this phosphate donation to ADP, and then we also consume a hydrogen ion, which is nice because it keeps our body's pH neutral. And over on the other side, we have free creatine, and we have ATP. So what does the creatine do? Think of what happens in the body as cycles that happen over and over and over again. It's going to go to the mitochondria, where it's going to do what? Pick up another phosphate, right? So that's how it works. Okay, so I want to pull this out to the practical realm now. The amount of PCR stored in muscle is about 3 times that of ATP. So during rest periods, recovery periods between high intensity intervals, if you ever wonder what your muscles are doing between sprints, as you're breathing hard and you're mentally preparing for that next sprint, what your muscles are doing, resynthesizing ATP and phosphocreatine. Where does the phosphorylation of creatine take place again? Mitochondria, right? Mitochondria. Okay. All right, so muscles differ in the amount of phosphocreatine. And phosphocreatine tends to increase over time with training, especially anaerobic training. So a key point, fast twitch fibers have lots of phosphocreatine versus slow twitch. Why does that make sense? Which fibers are going to be involved more on anaerobic metabolism? Your fast twitch, right? That's the anaerobic type of fiber. Okay. So it makes sense. They're going to be using phosphagen system, fast glycolysis with less emphasis on oxidative. Fast twitch fibers. It makes sense. It's specific to that type of fiber. Big burst of force and power output, but they're highly fatigable. Doesn't last very long. Okay, so other times, say it's just low intensity activities. An important point, the oxidative system takes time to warm up. Okay, so in a few months, it's going to be biting cold outside. You live in a spot that doesn't have a garage, so you got to go out, scrape your car off, right? Can anybody relate? Yeah. And start your car. You hope it starts. Okay, so your muscles are a lot like that. The oxidative system takes time to warm up, to ramp up. It takes about 3 minutes. So what if we're doing an activity? What are we going to do in that intervening time period while our muscles are upregulating to this oxidative metabolism? Yeah, systems that don't require what? Oxygen, right? Okay, so look at this. It's turning the page of a book. Okay, coming out of the starting blocks in a sprint, starting out on a long bicycle ride, at least part of the immediate need. While your oxidative system is ramping up, we're going to use the phosphagen system to fill that gap until our muscles are warmed up and ready to go. So alactic anaerobic production, so think of phosphagen system, involves the use of phosphocreatine. We can store that in our muscles. Creatine bound to inorganic phosphate. And so how much do we have in our muscles? What's an average number? Well, 120 to 140 millimoles per kilogram of dry muscle. Is there variation between people in how much creatine they can store? Yes, of course there is. There's variation in everything. You're a person that has a lot of fast twitch fibers, you're probably going to be on the upper end of this range, 160 millimoles per kilogram, but there is a limit. There is a limit beyond which we're going to excrete any excess creatine. So that brings into play a few different factors. I'm working my way towards creatine supplementation in this discussion here. So each day, approximately 2 grams of creatine are degraded in a non-reversible reaction to creatinine, ultimately excreted by the kidneys in the urine. So under most conditions, we produce 1 gram a day in the liver from these 3 amino acids, so arginine, glycine, methionine. We can also get up to 1 gram a day as part of our diet. So red meat, fish, poultry has creatine in it. So we're looking at about 2 grams. 1 gram produced by us, 1 gram ingested through your diet. About 95% is stored in skeletal muscle. Makes sense because that's where you use it. Okay. And then if you go within skeletal muscle, 30 to 40% is stored as free creatine, the rest as phosphocreatine. So again, where do we add the phosphate to creatine? Mitochondria, right? Mitochondria. Okay, so increasing phosphocreatine storage in skeletal muscle. Okay, so timely topic here. So different forms of creatine have been examined. So some of you taking a supplement, look on the label. Look on the label and see. So creatine monohydrate, 1993 came out. I remember because everyone at the gym I was at was on it in 1993. That was the first time over-the-counter creatine monohydrate was available in 1993. Creatine ethyl ester, creatine hydrochloride, buffered creatine. Buffered. Why would you need to add a buffer to it? What's in your stomach? Yeah, acid. Okay, so now they're trying, okay, well, if I can add a buffer to it, maybe you get it past the stomach into the blood and so on. So kind of interesting. Liquid creatine, typo there, creatine magnesium chelate. Okay, so all these different forms of creatine. And what do you think supplement companies do when they have this new form of creatine? Oh, yeah, it's the best ever, right? Yeah, increase your gains, all this stuff. It's BS. Okay, so based on the scientific evidence, creatine monohydrate is the recommended form. Okay, this is current. It's backed by the strongest research, demonstrating effectiveness at increasing your body's stores, okay, that's in muscle, and improving exercise performance. While several other forms exist, most of them have minimal research examining their effectiveness. You read one of those ads and you would think, wow, all this research. Okay. Additionally, the monohydrate form is relatively cheap. Good for a budget, right? Effective and widely available. The new forms may be promising, but the scientific information is needed before they can compete with creatine monohydrate. So, bottom line right there. Okay, so we're going past the phosphagen system. So what if exercise is beyond that initial 10 seconds? We're still giving maximal exertion, maximal maintainable intensity, but it's beyond 10 seconds now. So we're increasingly getting into another energy system, 1 to 2 minutes, high intensity activity. It's the fast glycolytic system. What's our energy substrate? What are we using in fast glycolysis? Yes, glycogen, from which we can get glucose, right? Yeah, glucose is our energy substrate. So the substrate for the phosphagen is phosphocreatine. Substrate for fast glycolysis is glucose. How fast can we go through those 10 reactions? And ultimately the 11th reaction, because that's the end point of fast glycolysis, is lactate. Hang on, let me get a drink here. Anybody watch this particular race right here? That's David Rudisha, setting the world record in the 800 meters at the 2012 London Olympics. So he ran both laps in about 50 seconds. And it was awesome. If you haven't watched that race and watched him just pull away, it was 1 minute, 40 seconds and change on his time. But nobody's even touched that since that time. So glycolytic system is an important supplement to the oxidative system, especially when we're working above anaerobic threshold. So oxidative system is maxed out, like in an 800 meters. You've got to have something else to meet the energy demand, because the energy demand is really high. So we go with glycolytic, fast glycolysis. So the end product is lactate. So this is our current, I would have a hard time pronouncing her name, but this is our current US and world champion in the 800 meters. The world record for females is a 153 something, and this lady's gone about 155 flat. So she's working her way down, really promising. She's just a young athlete, just graduated from college, now a professional. So she may get there down in that 153 range. So when production of lactate exceeds clearance, hydrogen ions begin to accumulate, very important point, due to the dissociation. What does it mean for something to dissociate? Like lactic acid dissociates. It breaks apart is a good way to think about it. Dissociation of lactic acid to create a state of metabolic acidosis. Okay. See how long my voice will last here. So, I want to turn your attention to your textbook, page 60. Just going to read you a quote here, highlighted in yellow here, top of the second column, page 60. So, the author really says this well. So, as stated in chapter 2, there is some unresolved controversy as to whether skeletal muscle actually produces lactate or lactic acid. Interesting. Unresolved controversy. Okay, although lactic acid, not lactate, represents the accepted classic view. So how many by the show of hands have heard the classic view? Lactic acid, not lactate. Yes, that's exactly how I was taught long time ago. Okay, so, and then she goes on. So even if lactic acid is the substance actually produced, so even if lactic acid is the substance actually produced, at physiological pH, what's our physiological pH? You know, what is our body's pH? That's a little low. 7.4. 7.4 is our body's pH. We can sit, so what's neutral pH? What's exactly neutral?
7.
Yeah, 7. So it's slightly on the alkaline side. So notice what she says here. Even if lactic acid is the substance actually produced at physiological pH, 99% of the lactic acid is dissociated immediately into a hydrogen ion and lactate. Okay. So that makes sense, because what do acids do from your chemistry? What does an acid do by definition? It releases what? Yes. Hydrogen ions, right? So lactic acid at physiological pH near 7, as soon as it's produced, it dissociates to what? It releases a hydrogen ion, and what do you have left? Just lactate. Is there anything wrong with lactate? What does lactate do? Nothing. It sits there. And then during recovery, what happens to the lactate? Yeah, it goes back to pyruvate. So what is the real problem? Hydrogen ions in excess quantities. Does our body have buffers to consume and neutralize hydrogen ions? Yes. Do we ingest substances at times to attempt to neutralize these hydrogen ions? Yes. Do you have an orange box in your cupboard at home? Arm & Hammer baking soda. What is baking soda? What's the chemical formula for baking soda? Sodium bicarbonate is a buffer. Our body makes bicarbonate, but there's been research to attempt to bolster our bicarbonate concentration, which in some cases has been shown to work. You're bolstering your ability to neutralize hydrogen ions, which is the cause of acidosis. So it's not lactate per se that creates the problem. How long does it take to clear lactate? So you're done with your interval workout, and now you're in the recovery period. So we're going to measure this in lab. You'll take a finger prick and you'll measure your blood lactate concentration. What's the time course? It's about 30 minutes, and your lactate levels are down to resting again. So lactate isn't something that hangs out in your muscles for days and destroys your muscle fibers. It's gone relatively quickly because lactate is then converted back to pyruvate, or in some cases glucose. Does that mean after a workout we can have a little bit of muscle damage that hurts, causes soreness? Yeah, of course it does. But our body has cleanup crew. It's called the immune system that goes in and cleans all that damage up, rebuilds it better than it was to begin with. And that's when we notice that muscle soreness is starting to go away. Okay, so to summarize, the classic, the old view. Pyruvic acid is converted to lactic acid, and lactic acid releases these hydrogen ions that promotes muscle fatigue. Okay. So that's true to a certain extent because an acid releases hydrogen ions, but we're forgetting that once lactic acid releases the hydrogen ions, what do you have left over? It's the lactate. There's nothing wrong. Lactate doesn't, it's just an energy substrate for heart and skeletal muscle and so on. So the new view, okay, so we're going to progress this a little further. It's pyruvate, not pyruvic acid, that is the end product of glycolysis. Step 10, we get to pyruvate, not pyruvic acid. Okay, now what happens, and we'll go through this, pyruvate is converted to lactate, and in that process, the conversion of pyruvate to lactate actually consumes hydrogen ions. So if we're consuming hydrogen ions, is that good or bad? We're taking them out of solution, we're neutralizing them, which is good because that keeps our pH within neutral range. If our pH is dropping, what are conditions like inside a cell? A lower pH means what for acidity? Yeah, higher acidity. So you have to remember how that works. Lower pH means acidity is going up. Okay, so here's the actual reaction. Okay, so we have pyruvate here. And what's this? NADH plus hydrogen ion. Okay. So when we have sufficient oxygen, what is NADH plus a hydrogen ion normally going to do with those hydrogens? If there's sufficient oxygen, everything is nice and steady state, what's going to happen? Where's that NAD going to deposit those hydrogens? Skeletal muscle or cardiac muscle, it's going to go to the same spot. Where is that? Where is that? Mitochondria, right? So under normal conditions, you know that. Normal conditions, NADH plus a hydrogen ion, it's going to take those, put them in the mitochondria. Now, we did talk about some differences between skeletal and cardiac muscle, but nevertheless, those hydrogens are still going into the mitochondria. Okay, now, what if it's not steady state? What if it's very high intensity exercise? What if the mitochondria are working at their maximal capacity And the mitochondria are not going to take, where does pyruvate generally go? Steady state? If it's steady state,
Oh, it just goes.
pyruvate also goes where? Into the mitochondria, right? Right? Okay. All right, come on, guys. So pyruvate, yeah, it's going to go to the mitochondria, right? And then pyruvate is converted to acetyl-CoA, right? Okay, so everything is nice, steady state, aerobic. Both of these are going to the mitochondria, except during high intensity. Mitochondria have reached their maximal capacity, and now the mitochondria won't take any more pyruvate, and it won't take any more hydrogens. So how is glycolysis going to continue? We've got to somehow free up NADH plus a hydrogen ion. Because once it drops off those hydrogens, what's it going to do? It's going to go back to which step in glycolysis? Remember, test question? Step 6, right? Step 6 of glycolysis. It's just going to do that same job over and over. It's like a taxi cab, shuttling these hydrogen ions. Sometimes, under most conditions, steady state, plenty of oxygen, it's going to go to the mitochondria as well as pyruvate. But now it's high intensity. Mitochondria are not accepting anymore. They're working at all they can do. They can't take any more pyruvate or hydrogens, so we have to do something. Because now you've got the next glucose coming down through glycolysis, through those 10 steps. So for ATP production to continue under anaerobic conditions, we have to do something with the pyruvate and the hydrogen. So here's what we do. We have this enzyme, lactate dehydrogenase, LDH. You'll want to remember that, lactate dehydrogenase. And lactate dehydrogenase catalyzes this reaction. So what do we have on the other side? What we have is lactate and NAD. So what happened during this reaction is NADH plus the hydrogen ion. These hydrogens are given to pyruvate. These hydrogens are given to pyruvate. Okay, so how many hydrogens? 1, 2, 3. So if it gains 2 more, how many is it going to have? 5. How many does lactate have? 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. High intensity exercise, mitochondria are maxed out. We've got to keep glycolysis going for ATP production. NADH plus a hydrogen ion is simply going to pass these to pyruvate to make lactate. And we now have free NAD. What's NAD going to do? It's going to go get more what? Yes. What step? I call it step 6. Yes, step 6. You see, it just does the same thing over and over and over again. Okay, so we're past the exercise. Now we're into the recovery period. Okay? Now we have plenty of oxygen. The mitochondria are getting caught up on their work. What are we going to do with the lactate? We're going to convert it back to pyruvate. Where's pyruvate going to go? Mitochondria are no longer maxed out, so it's going to go to the mitochondria. What's NAD going to do with those hydrogens now? Put them in the mitochondria, so everything just continues. So this is kind of a temporary state, the purpose of which is to free up NAD, because that's what keeps glycolysis going. We have to have NAD to make step 6 of glycolysis work. That's where it's going to pick up those hydrogens. Okay, if you have any questions, do we need to review that whole thing? Any part of it?
So I'm just kind of trying to process it. So you still have the acidosis, even though, because like the lactates, oh gosh, I'm trying to think of
Okay,
what my
so
brain said.
acidosis is excess what?
Hydrogen.
Hydrogen ions, more being released than we can consume.
Right.
Okay, This is one avenue whereby those hydrogen ions are consumed.
Okay.
We
Okay,
have
so it's
lot-
just them still
yeah.
being there, there's just not enough.
The big picture is when reactions that release hydrogen ions exceed all reactions, including this one, that consume,
Okay.
you're going to be headed into an acidic state. So this is just one avenue for disposal.
Okay.
We could call it, I don't know if we would call it a buffer per se, but we would call it an alkalizing reaction, because it's taking these hydrogen ions out of the cytoplasm, attaching them to lactate where they are not contributing to acidosis.
They're not really contributing to anything, it's just somewhere for them to go.
Temporary state. Now, we'll get into this because lactate can be shuttled through the circulation to the heart or the liver, and we have this process called gluconeogenesis. So what's the heart and the liver going to do with lactate if it's gluconeogenesis? We're going to take lactate and do what with it? Convert it to glucose. Okay. So lactate isn't a waste product. For years it's like waste, metabolic waste. No, it's an energy substrate. So we can use it for ATP. Okay, so why could lactate production be beneficial? So here's a landmark review written back in 2004. So this was written about the third year of my doctoral program at Arizona State, and this really caused a lot of discussion in the field when this came out, because here was someone directly challenging the classic view. The traditional view is now challenged, and so people started to change their thinking. So why could lactate production be beneficial? Well, here's a direct quote. The correct physiological interpretation of these biomechanical events is lactate production slows a developing metabolic acidosis and assists in proton removal from the cell. So how does it slow a developing metabolic acidosis? Yeah. It's taking that out of the equation, so it's no longer contributing to acidosis. Okay, so what else does, well, this is from a more recent textbook, 2016, Bioenergetics of Exercise and Training, from Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning. So why might use of the term lactic acid no longer be correct? The formation of lactate from pyruvate is catalyzed by the enzyme, remember, LDH, right? Lactate dehydrogenase. Here we go. It's like, you just need to take it away from me, like my wife takes away the remote. Okay, so lactate dehydrogenase, LDH. Okay, sometimes mistakenly, the end result of this reaction is said to be the formation of lactic acid. That's no longer the accepted view. However, at physiological pH, okay, right, we know that, near 7, lactate, not lactic acid, is the product of the lactate dehydrogenase reaction. So you're given the page numbers in the citation there. So what might be the key cause of peripheral fatigue during high intensity exercise? So although, this is again in quotes, so although the muscular fatigue experienced during exercise often correlates with high tissue concentrations of lactate. So we'll demonstrate that in lab. You'll do treadmill or bike, one of the two, and then you'll take a blood sample, and it'll be high in lactate, okay? But it's misinterpreted that the lactate is actually what's causing the fatigue. Lactate is not, pretty direct there, not the cause of fatigue. Protons, okay, hydrogen ions, accumulation during fatigue reduces intracellular pH, okay, so we know that. Inhibits glycolytic reactions, okay, 10 reactions, and directly interferes with muscle contraction. Also, the decrease in pH, referred to as metabolic acidosis, may be responsible for much of the peripheral fatigue that occurs during exercise. So
pretty much is the reason lactate also increases is just because there's more of the hydrogens and they're trying to do something with it. If not,
lactate is an indirect marker for metabolic acidosis. So it's not the cause, but it's,
It's just going up,
Yeah.
because there's more for it to do.
yeah, more for it to do. I like
Yeah.
that, where it's
It has a
It's
job
taking out
actually, yeah.
those, yeah. Okay, so questions at this point. How are we doing on time?
11:35.
Okay, let's keep going. Okay, so the generation of ATP from slow aerobic glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and electron transport, oxidative phosphorylation is constantly in operation at some level. So right now, the emphasis is oxidative metabolism. Provides most of what you need at rest. Okay, so when we exercise at a steady state, the oxidative system, like your car, it warms up, takes about 3 minutes, and then proceeds at a rate that supplies most of the ATP. So we can max out the oxidative system. So we can progressively increase the intensity, the oxygen consumption requirements until we reach a max. And we can test that. We have some great equipment, we can test that directly. So the highest amount of oxygen the body can consume during heavy dynamic exercise for the aerobic production of ATP is called VO2 max. That's one of the key endurance characteristics. It's not the only one though, so remember efficiency is probably the most important. So if we were to look at this contribution of aerobic and anaerobic to exercise based on the duration. So the maximal maintainable intensity for a certain time, we find that at about 75 seconds, it's about half and half. So you're getting half from aerobic, you're getting half from anaerobic. That's metabolism. So 2 anaerobic metabolic systems, 1 aerobic metabolic system, they're each chipping in about 50% to the energy demand. So that's 115 seconds, or no, that's a minute and 15 seconds, excuse me, a minute and 15 seconds, it'd be half and half. So we don't generally measure percent VO2 max, we go with a percent heart rate max, because it's easier to measure. So what does this say about your own conditioning then? If you want to develop both energy systems, or both anaerobic and aerobic fitness, you've got to go at least how long? 75 seconds, right? So if you're keeping your sprint intervals at 20 seconds, you're really not doing a whole lot for aerobic fitness. So what do you notice is, as we go further, what happens to the aerobic component? It's increasing to where at about, I don't know, 2 minutes? No, that's 120 minutes. So 2 minutes would be right here, 3 minutes and so on. You can see now your body's engine is getting warmed up and you've got increasing aerobic contribution. So if you want to improve your VO2 max, I would do intervals that are at least a minute 15 seconds, because you're getting at least half of the energy production from oxidative metabolism. If you want to improve mostly just your anaerobic fitness, then you can stay down in this area, short sprints. Excuse me. So the 3 sources of ATP, we already know that. Okay, so I want you to notice that they have a little bit different names here. Glycolytic system, in your textbook, sometimes called the lactate system. And then the abbreviation for the oxidative system. So this is called the time energy continuum. So they're all contributing, and it's the maximal maintainable intensity. So you'll notice the contribution of each of these 3. Heavy emphasis for the first up to about 2 minutes on the first 2, ATP, PCR, and glycolysis. And then as the intensity gradually increases beyond 2 or 3 minutes, it's mostly oxidative. So 4 key conclusions. So this is good test material, okay? All 3 energy systems are involved for all durations. Phosphagen system for activities that are about 10 seconds or less. Glycolytic, fast glycolysis, 1 to 2 minutes. And by 2 minutes of exercise, the oxidative system is the predominant source of ATP. Okay, so we're working our way into the last part of class for today. So how do we measure anaerobic metabolism or anaerobic fitness? We're pretty good at measuring aerobic fitness, aren't we? Lots of tests, step test. Remember the pyramid test from 106? You missed out on that one. Did you do it? You did that, the pyramid test from Kin 106, yeah. So you estimate your VO2 from that. But if you're talking about anaerobic fitness, how do you measure it? So if something is studied, it has to be measurable. So we can look at ATP and phosphocreatine and lactate from blood samples or biopsies. It's pretty hard to do. We don't have a muscle lab here. Should be grateful for that, by the way, because then we'd be, putting needles in your muscles and sipping off pieces. No. I've heard of that, though, at other schools. Tests of anaerobic power. Okay, so we can look at peak power versus anaerobic capacity is mean power. So what's the difference between a peak power and a mean power? Which one's always going to be higher? The peak, yeah. So the peak is the highest of the high. Mean is over the entire event. So the mean implies at some points it was higher, at some points it was lower, but if you were to just describe the whole thing, that would be it. Whereas peak, you're taking the instantaneous highest point of the duration. So we have a Wingate test. So you have 7.5% of your body mass on the flywheel. So remind me, what units do we use for body mass?
Kilograms?
So quickly, I want you, on your paper, to convert your body weight in pounds to kilograms. Body weight in pounds to kilograms. So you say your pounds divided by what, Danny? 2.2. I'm sure in other classes you do this all the time. Okay, so how much are you going to be pedaling against? So you remember in lab we have those little metal plates. You put them in the basket and then you drop the basket. Okay, so we're going to let you know right now for your Wingate test that we do, I think it's week 5 or week 6 in lab. How much are you going to be pedaling against for 30 seconds as hard as you can go? So I want you to multiply your kilograms by 0.075 to get your load in the basket. So pounds divided by 2.2 to get kilograms, kilograms multiplied by 0.075. So how much, Jackie, how much is your load in the basket going to be? 4.125 kilograms. So she's going to have 4 of those big thick plates and then at least 1 of those fractional plates. So we have plates in there that are 1/10 of a kilogram that we use for that. Okay, Michael, you're going to be
7.33.
That's going to be fun. Not sure we have 7 in there. Well, I think we do. 9 of those great big thick plates. So you gotta do that, 30 seconds. We can look at both of these factors here. We have the software, put it on the big TV screen so you can actually see in real time your power output. Okay, we're gonna be doing this next test while the weather is still good. So typically in a semester, especially in Montana, if you wait too long, you're not gonna find a stairwell that's outside where you can do this. So I'm almost thinking of this upcoming week. The forecast looks pretty good, and get it done before it gets too cold and ice and so on. So the Margarita Kaleman stair climb test. Okay, so this is really an interesting test. Ideally, it's done with fancy equipment where you can measure the time interval between where the foot contacts the 3rd step versus the 9th step. So that's what your timing is. And we'll just have to have you take several repetitions and with a stopwatch. So you're starting the clock when the foot hits the 3rd step, and then when the foot hits the 9th step, you're stopping the clock. So you can see here in this example, 0.65 seconds between hitting this step and hitting this step. So you have 6 meters, which is about 20 feet. You have kind of a run up, and then you're just going up these 9 steps as fast as you can. And so the calculation for power is your body weight and how much vertical displacement you moved your body weight divided by the time it took you to do it. I'll bet several of you do this just on how many of you just go running and upstairs, right? You've already, you know what it's going to be like. So let me show you what that looks like, as well as the wind gate. So this is our stair sprint test. So this is, to me, it looks like a group just like you that we're doing a project to show this test. And they videoed it and posted it, so we'll watch it.
The goal of this test is to measure an athlete's strength, power, and speed. The equipment needed for this test specifically include a lead-up area of 20 feet, 9 or more stairs, 3 cones to mark every 3 stairs, measuring tape to measure height of stairs.
So as I was thinking about campus, I was actually thinking the liberal arts building. How many of you have seen those stairs on the west side of the building? I think that would be perfect.
And length of runway. A stopwatch to measure the time it takes the athlete to get from the 3rd stair to the 9th stair, but in our case, we used our phone. And a scale to measure the weight of your athlete. As seen in the last slide, the first step you should take is weighing your athlete. For step number 2, measure each step to make sure they are at least 7 inches tall. In step number 3, the test requires that you have 20 feet of runway.
I think over there we would have 20,
first step,
pretty easy 20 feet.
Measure 20 feet out, then mark it so that you don't forget your spot. And finally, for step number 4, put a cone on every 3rd step so the runner knows which steps to take while running up the stairs. Before conducting the test, make sure your athlete has plenty of time to warm up and stretch so they are not injured while partaking in the test.
I mean, it's just like, I just love it. We're gonna have so much fun next week. I think we'll go ahead and do it.
Now that your athlete is well and warmed up, allow your athlete several practice trials to test out the steps so that they can safely
So you gotta
ensure
get the time
that
from
they're capable
here
of
to
doing the
here.
task.
So you're gonna have to run a stopwatch really well. We'll probably have multiple stopwatches so we can make sure everyone is in range.
While recording your trials, it is important to start the stopwatch as soon as the athlete's foot touches the third step, and stopping the stopwatch as soon as their foot leaves the ninth step. You should conduct 3 official trials. The second and the third should be performed with a 2 to 3 minute recovery period between each one.
Okay, so preview for next week. And then let's watch this. This is the Wingate test.
All right, so today we have Mark Hannigan here. He's going to be the test
Similar.
subject on what's called the Wingate test.
Like to
Wingate
ours.
test is an approximation of your anaerobic threshold. It's done on a cycle ergometer, as you can see. The test entails a warm-up procedure, which he's doing right now, followed by 30 seconds of completely all-out sprinting. During that time, the weight on the front of this is dropped and applied to the flywheel right here. That weight corresponds to 7.5% of its body weight. At that time, he sprints as hard as he can for 30 seconds, and we calculate power output over the entire course of the 30 seconds, as well as every 5 seconds. Power output is calculated by the angular velocity of the pedals, as well as the torque that's applied to the flywheel.
So we have software that does all that. So you don't have to worry about counting how many times his feet go around.
All right, ready, set, go.
How many of you have ever done a 30-second all-out sprint with running or cycling? It's hard.
9, 10 seconds, 20 more seconds, as fast as you can go, as fast as you can go. All right,
Don't eat a
halfway
big
there,
meal before
halfway
you come
there.
to the lab
Keep
on
pushing,
that day.
keep pushing. 12 more seconds, 10 more seconds, keep pushing. The last 10 seconds, last 7 seconds, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and stop. So now you should be spinning
Put the
easy.
basket up.
The weight up so that we make sure he gets a proper cool down and blood continues to proliferate through his legs. If he didn't cool down, then we could have blood pooling in the lower legs and you could have the subject pass out. In this table, we can see his peak power, which represents his peak absolute power, as well as anaerobic capacity over the entire test in average power. Next, we have a graph of his power over the time of the entire test.
So we have really nice software that gives you like your own printout of your test.
5 seconds. In review, we're calculating power in this test. Power is calculated as work over time, or force times distance over time. The results from the test show the maximal power, which is related to his maximal anaerobic potential, his average power, which is his work done over the entire test, and the decline, which is his anaerobic fatigue. We primarily use 2 energy systems during this test. The first is the ATP creatine phosphate system for the first 5 to 10 seconds of the test. Following
Remember the
that
time
is
it is.
anaerobic glycolysis, used for the remainder of the test. In anaerobia, there's a rapid decrease in muscle pH, which is known to be a cause of fatigue.
If you're a college student like me, especially.
Okay, so a couple more key points for today. This is what a Wingate test looks like. So again, it's 30 seconds, all out. I want you to take a look at these time intervals that overlap. So typically the peak power happens in the first 5 seconds. So right out of the gate, basket drops and off you go, hard as you can go. So you can see the 5-second total revolutions. So you can see between seconds 2 and 6, the pedals spun 10.25 times. That's 10.25 revolutions, 10.25 revolutions during that interval right there. So that's where you're getting the peak power output. You can see the watts over here at 9.07. Okay, so what happens to the 5-second segment revolutions as you get down towards 30 seconds? So take a look. So you can see fatigue is really starting to manifest. So hangs on pretty good for about 10 seconds. Which energy system would that be? It's phosphagen, right? Beyond that point, we've got ATP breakdown exceeding ATP regeneration. Hydrogen ions are starting to be released. We start to get that metabolic acidosis. So beyond 10 seconds, it's just really hard to hang on until the final 26 to 30 seconds. You're looking at 5.5 revolutions. So I'm going to teach you, probably because we're almost out of time for today, on Tuesday, I'm going to teach you how to calculate these things. And it's really not as hard as you think. Every time that flywheel goes around, it's a distance of 6 meters. So 6 meters per revolution. The last thing I want you to do today, I want you to see if you can count how many total revolutions there were for the entire test. So what you're going to do on your paper, I want you to see if you can get this right. You can get out a calculator if you want. So you're going to go 1 to 5 was 10. And then you're going to go 6 to 10. You're going to go down here was 9. So you're adding 10 plus 9. And then what? You're going to go 11 to 15. So see if you can keep adding those up. See how many total you come up with for the entire test. So just go with each 5-second segment. 1 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15, 16 to 20, so how many revolutions happened in that 30 seconds is the question. (21 to 25). (26 to 30). So you should come up with 45.25. 45.25. Okay, so first thing on Tuesday, I'm going to show you where these calculations come from, so it makes sense. And we're going to talk about, amino acid metabolism, and then epoch for Tuesday. So why don't you just leave your sheets on your desk? I don't want to cough all over you and get you sick, so why don't you leave that out, and I'll see you on Tuesday. Hope you have a good weekend.